als allgemeine Fragen des Lebens und Sterbens behandelt hat, wie wichtige Themen, die nach wie vor diskutiert werden, wie Abtreibung, Sterbehilfe und dergleichen. Und auch insbesondere von in den letzten 15 Jahren vielleicht auch mehr den effektiven Algorithmen entwickelt hat, wo es insbesondere auch wieder um Armut in der Welt geht und um allgemeine moralische Probleme, die die Globalisierung verursacht. Dazu ist auch eines seiner wesentlichen Privatismus. Ganz kurz, Professor Singer ist australischer Philosoph, Australier, aber mit österreichischen Wurzeln, Austria, also nicht verwechseln mit Österreich und Australien, wissen, dass das zusammen verwechselt wird. Also australischer Philosoph mit österreichischen Wurzeln. Und er ist nach seinem Studium in Australien und England dann auch lange Professor gewesen an der Monash University in Australien, bevor dann, glaube ich, Ende der 90er Jahre auch nach Princeton ging, Princeton University, aber sie sind in den letzten Jahren auch wieder an der University of Melbourne tätig. Princeton und University of Melbourne. Ganz kurz noch wichtige Werke, die meisten kennen das, aber für die wenigen, die noch nichts gelesen haben, der Singer, ein paar der wichtigsten Punkte. Ein berühmtes Werk, das bereits im Jahr 1975 erschienen ist, Animal Liberation, also was dann später Anfang der 80er Jahre bei Freien in Deutsch heißt es, veröffentlicht wurde. Und das, was ich hier habe in Deutsch, das ist Practical Ethics, das ist Ende 1979 in Englisch veröffentlicht worden und auch Anfang der 80er, 84er bei der ersten Auflage. Das ist schon die dritte Auflage. Und bei Professor Singer ist es so, dass die neuen Auflagen meistens nicht wortgebend sind, sondern tatsächlich substanziell neue Inhalte haben wie in dieser. Und von diesem Buch ist Exemplare hier zu erwerben nach dem Vortrag und Professor Singer ist zunächst auch zu signieren, wenn Sie das wünschen. Und es geht auch, die Finanzierung schaut aus? Österreichisch. Also wir schießen was zu. Genau, also das ist auch Zeit. Völlig im Marsch. Und wir, dadurch ist es möglich, den Autorenpreis hier zu ermöglichen. 10 Euro. Ganz kurz erwähne ich auch Pro Domo, das auch in einer Reihe, die in unserem Fachbericht veröffentlicht wurde, Professor Singer mit Kollegen Hilbert Duse, Individuals, Humans, Persons in den 90er Jahren veröffentlicht hat, das steht auch in der deutschen Übersetzung. Und wenn ich mir den Titel nicht merke, sage ich jetzt, eines der letzten Bücher ist The Most Good You Can Do, How Effective Altruism is Changing Ideas About Living Ethically. Das ist auch schon in Deutsch erschienen. Effektiver Altruismus, eine Anleitung zum ethischen Leben, eines der letzten Werke. Aber es kommen fast jährlich neue Bücher von Professor Singer raus, ich wollte nur eine der Bekannte erwähnen und es bricht nicht ab, möglicherweise. Und wir sind sehr froh, dass er bei seinem Europabesuch, falls noch nicht vergessen hat, und wir freuen uns jetzt sehr zu seinem Vortrag zu den Grundlagen der Guiding Principles of Money Ethics. Danke.
If I speak English, my German is not quite good enough for the professional topics that I need to discuss.
Eine kurze Anmerkung, wir könnten in den Bernhard-Hörteil gehen. Hätten alle Leute einen Platz.
Zu viel Zeit in Anspruch nehmen, glaube ich, oder? Und danke für das Nachschauen.
I am also planning, as suggested, to speak about guiding principles, and so I wanted not to discuss, at least immediately, the more applied issues that I talk about. That is, the issues about sanctity of life, or even about animals or effective altruism. I will come to them at the end of what I'm saying, but I wanted to talk a bit about the underpinnings of my views, and also about some of the ways in which they've changed over the last 10 years or so. So, for most of my career, in terms of meta-ethics, I accepted a non-cognitivist view, that is the idea that there are not really objective truths in ethics, but there are, when we make ethical judgments, we make prescriptions, we prescribe what ought to be done under the condition that we must be prepared to prescribe this universally. this is a position that was developed by Professor R.M. Hare at Oxford in a number of his books. But more recently, I've questioned that. I suppose you could say for quite a long time, I tried to reconcile prescriptivism with the idea that reason has a role to play in ethics. Because obviously what I was doing in my applied ethics was to try to reason our way to certain conclusions. Not just to say, this is how I feel about things, but rather that this is the way we all ought to act, because these are the kinds of actions that we have the most reason to do. However, I never quite succeeded in reconciling that idea that reason has an important role to play with prescriptivism. And so I started to have doubts about it. And those doubts were somewhat reinforced when I read an early draft of Derek Parfit's important work on what matters. Some of you may know came out in 2 large volumes, I think in 2011, if I remember rightly. One of the things that led me to rethink my view was an argument against Hume's view of reason. So I think Hare's universal prescriptivism was really based on an assumption that Hume was right about reason when he said reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. So that idea of reason goes back to David Hume, is one, in fact, that is very widely used today. Economists more or less take it for granted, that reason is instrumental, that it starts from whatever desires you happen to have, and it's rational to do what will fulfill those desires, fulfill most of those desires. And therefore, on that basis, reason is not going to question the desires we have. We just start from some root desires. Now, Parfit in On What Matters has an example that challenges that, and that I think is very difficult to deny. He imagines a person who has what he calls future Tuesday indifference. Maybe I'll write it up in case you're not familiar with the idea. Okay, so this person is just like you and me in almost every respect. So, for example, if someone says to you, today you could either have a mild headache or let me torture you for an hour, you will presumably say, thanks, I'd rather have a mild headache than be tortured for an hour. But today is Monday, right? Suppose I said tomorrow you can choose between having a mild headache or I'll torture you for an hour. This person differs from you and me, because you and me would make the same judgment about tomorrow as we would about today. But this person thinks, oh, tomorrow is Tuesday. In fact, it's a future Tuesday. It's not, today is not Tuesday, it's a Tuesday in the future. And this person has a strange feature of being indifferent, doesn't care about what happens to him on future Tuesdays. So he doesn't care about whether he gets tortured for an hour tomorrow or has a mild headache. And in fact, if the choice is you can have a mild headache today or I'll torture you on Tuesday for an hour or maybe even all day, he'll say, well, since I don't care about what happens to me on Tuesdays and I don't want a mild headache now, I'll have the torture on Tuesday. Okay? Now, this is a very strange person, obviously. We've never met such a person, but we can imagine such a person. And Parfit's point is that this person is clearly irrational. That puts it rather mildly, you might think. Actually crazy. But at least this person is irrational. And yet, for somebody who follows Hume's view of reason, they can't say that there's anything irrational about what he's doing. If he really has these desires, just happens to have very strange desires, then he is acting in order to maximize the satisfaction of his desires. And remember that these desires are about future Tuesday. So when he agrees that he'll be tortured for hours tomorrow, rather than have a mild headache today, it doesn't mean that he doesn't care tomorrow what happens to him, because tomorrow, once tomorrow comes around, it's a present Tuesday. So he isn't indifferent about present Tuesdays, he's only indifferent about future Tuesdays. So he hates being tortured just as much as any of us would hate being tortured. But in terms of the decision he makes today, he's just maximally satisfying his desires. So if you agree with me and with Parfit that this person is irrational, then there's something wrong with Hume's view of reason. And I find that argument compelling. And so I had to rethink my support for Hume's view of reason. And at the same time, I was thinking about a variety of other issues about objectivism in ethics, as I mentioned. And it seemed to me that my assumption, which I held for a long time, that Hume was right about reason, and that therefore non-cognitivist views of ethics are all that is really left, because you can't reason about something except desires, that I ought to reconsider that. So on that basis, I rejected that view and accepted the view that Parfit was defending, that there are normative truths, objective normative truths, one of which is violated by this person. Exactly how we formulate the truth that person violates is another question. And that on that basis you can also say that there are normative ethical truths. So I started to look at ways of defending that, both in Parfit and also in the 19th century utilitarian philosopher Henry Sidgwick. I don't know how many of you have read Sidgwick. If you study utilitarianism, at least in English-speaking countries, people mostly read John Stuart Mill. But Sidgwick, who came later than Mill, in the late 19th century, is a much better philosopher. Mill makes lots of really, I think, you could say mistakes, or you could say he just doesn't write clearly. But it's one or the other. Whereas Sidgwick is much more careful and writes at much greater length. Mill's Utilitarianism is a short book that appeared in a magazine in a couple of articles. Sidgwick's book, The Methods of Ethics, is 500 pages, fairly densely written, so not as widely read, but he's a very good philosopher. And Sidgwick argues that there are some basic axioms of ethics that are self-evidently true. Essentially, there are three of them. There's a principle of justice, which is a bit like Hare's universalizability, for those of you who know it. It says that if I make a moral judgment that something is wrong for me, I can't say, well, let's put it the other way. If I make a moral judgment that something is wrong for you, and I acknowledge that I'm in the same situation as you, I can't say that it's not wrong for me. So there has to be some other difference, apart from the fact that you're you and I'm me, that would make it wrong. Second principle is a principle of prudence, which actually relates, I think, to what this person is getting wrong. The principle of prudence says I should give equal value to all moments of my existence, at least equal intrinsic value, discounting only for uncertainty. So this person doesn't give equal value to what happens to him on a future Tuesday. And although that's, as I said, pretty bizarre, a lot of people don't give equal value to the more distant future. If you put off making an appointment with your dentist, hoping that your toothache will go away, quite likely you're not giving equal weight to your future. And economists actually frequently discount the future, basing it on observations of people's behaviour, which I also think is a is a mistake, quite a serious mistake if they get involved in debates about climate change, for instance, where the costs are mostly in the future. So principle of prudence is the second one, and the third one, and I think the most important one, is a principle of universal benevolence. So Sidgwick says, he imagines us taking the point of view of the universe, to use his phrase. Not that he really thinks the universe has a point of view, but we can imagine taking that point of view, and from that point of view, my own well-being is of no more importance than the similar well-being of anyone else. So what that really means is I ought to work, as I'm concerned about my own well-being, I ought to be equally concerned about the well-being of everyone insofar as I can affect that well-being. And again, discounting for uncertainties about whether I will or will not succeed in helping improve the well-being of others. So Sidgwick thinks that they are essentially objective truths that if we reflect on them, if we think about them carefully, we can't really deny. And I'm inclined now to think that that's right, and that that does provide a basis for thinking about ethics. And the question is, what kind of ethics does that lead to? Well, particularly with regard to the third principle of universal benevolence, it leads to something that looks very like utilitarianism. And that's not a coincidence, because Sidgwick was a utilitarian, although he had some problems about whether he had good arguments against egoism. So the egoist who says, I should further my own interest, and so should you should further your own interest, and you should further your own interest. Sidgwick thought that was a difficult position to refute, and at the end of the Methods of Ethics, he's in a bit of a quandary about the idea that there seem to be these two possible principles of ethics, and he can't really, in some way, reconcile them. Now, it leads to, the axiom of universal benevolence leads to this idea that we ought to promote the good of everybody as far as we can do. That opens up to a number of other questions. One is, what does the good of everyone consist in? And here too I've somewhat changed my views over the last few years. So for most of my career I called myself a preference utilitarian. Which meant that I thought what we ought to do is to maximize the satisfaction of preferences of all those affected by our actions. So this is also a view that's widely held by economists who see preferences as expressed by people's own decisions and think that the greatest welfare is to do the most you can to maximize preferences and minimize the frustration or thwarting of preferences. Now, that was also the view that that Hare took, who I mentioned earlier, and in a way he took it because he thought that that's really all you could do. You could universalize your own preferences, and then you got to kind of universal preference satisfaction. But once you think that there are objective truths in morality, then you have other possibilities. And given that people may have very strange sets of preferences, this again goes back to this kind of preference, but there would be others as well, you can then ask, well, if people have preferences that are objectively bad for them, bad for others, should we really be trying to satisfy those preferences? If we think maybe not, then we need to ask what other values there are that we might want to maximize. And Sidgwick's argument essentially was that when we reflect on different things that we think might be of value, what we come up with is the idea that value depends on there being minds. In other words, states of consciousness. If there was no consciousness in the universe, there would be nothing of intrinsic value. Nothing would really matter without consciousness, because nothing could go well or badly for anything that's not conscious. I could break this marker, for example, and that would be something that was bad for me because I might want to continue writing for it, or for the next person in the room who might want to write with it. But it wouldn't be bad for the marker because there's nothing that it's like to be the marker, either intact or broken. On the other hand, if I were to go and punch one of you and that hurt you, or maybe broke your jaw, that would be very bad for you. You would be in pain, would be uncomfortable and so on. So that would matter, not just instrumentally, but that would matter intrinsically. And you can see why this is relevant to my views, and that doesn't just apply to human beings, that applies to any conscious being. So that applies to whichever non-human animals are conscious beings. It's also bad to hurt them because that's then they're in a negative state of consciousness. They're feeling pain rather than enjoying their life. So, and Sidgwick, like the other utilitarians, was clear that his ethics was not only about humans. He didn't spend a lot of time talking about animals, but he stated quite plainly that the suffering or the pains of animals and the pleasures of animals, non-human animals, also counts. Is also part of ethics. Now, I think that's all quite plausible. And it leads to the view that certain states of consciousness are intrinsically valuable, or some are positively intrinsically valuable, some are negatively intrinsically valuable. So, at least to take the most obvious ones, pleasures and happiness of various kinds, satisfaction with life is positively valuable, pain, suffering, misery is negatively, is negative intrinsic value. A lot of people might now start to say, though, well, but there seem to be other things in ethics that are also equally true, or seem equally obvious. And people will come up with various suggestions of their own. Some of them might be various ideas of human rights, that we have a right to life, or various other kinds of rights. Some might be that there are